So welcome everyone. Ryan, what I'd like for you to do is to introduce TJ, and then TJ, I'd like for you to introduce Ryan.
Great. Thanks for being here, everyone. I'm really happy to be back here. And it's interesting because I was telling TJ and Emily that when you first reached out to me to do this, my main enthusiasm for doing these sessions on integral life is to spotlight or give a voice to people whose work I really admire and really appreciate. And TJ was one of the people that first came to my mind. So I'm really happy that we can make this happen. And TJ lives on Vashon Island in Washington. So he's like, I don't know, 3 hours up the road from where I live. And he reached out to me about some of his work on what he called anti-memetics and found it very fascinating and very consonant with some of the theoretical work I was doing in meta-ideological politics. And so we kind of hit it off and became friends. And I've also introduced TJ to other friends in the Seattle area. And he's also a musician and has a family there. So really excited to be sharing some of his brilliant content with you all today.
Excellent.
Yeah. Thank you, Ryan. I just want to say first of all, I'm happy to be here. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I have a lot of respect for the Integral project, but also I'm a huge, huge fan of Ryan and meta-ideological politics. I think he's doing something incredibly important. I think this is this is the future of political theory to me. This is his work is sort of the future coming at me. That's what I feel like. Ryan is concerned with he has this great way of articulating it. He's concerned with not changing what people believe, but changing the way they relate to their beliefs, and therefore the way they can relate to each other. And so we can better relate to each other when we relate to our beliefs in a healthier way. And so he does this through a meta-ideological perspective. He does this through his work in depolarization and work in kind of de-escalating extremism. And he's a very inspiring person to me. He's like this presentation I think of as very much like a collaborative project with him in a lot of ways. His ideas are all over it. So I'm really excited to be doing this with him.
Excellent. Well, the stage is yours, so the two of you can start. And hopefully, will there be time for Q&A, Ryan and TJ? Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I do want to apologize today that I'm actually going to be leaving sooner, but you can carry on for as long as you need to. There's no other session after this today at Integral Life. So if you need to go later than the 90-minute slot, that's fine too. But I'll be leaving around the top of the hour today. Oh, yes.
Okay. So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we'll get started. Is everyone seeing that okay?
Yes, good.
Okay, great. Okay, so in order to kind of set up our approach to anti-memetics and the information ecosystem, we're going to start with a kind of a quick introduction to memetics here. Memetics is the study of cultural evolution via units of transmissible information called memes, right? Which are themselves a conceptual analog to the gene. And so this concept was coined by Richard Dawkins in his book, The Selfish Gene. Memes, okay, so their energy, right, in a sense, derives from our attention, and they evolve and compete for survival in our information ecosystem. So just as we might like conceive of genes competing for energy, survival, and propagation through evolutionary fitness in a biological ecosystem, so can we imagine an information ecosystem of memes, right? And to clarify here, we're not ascribing agency to memes. Rather, these are the selection units of the evolutionary algorithm that operates on culture. And so in that sense, our evolutionary terms are not metaphorical. They're literal insofar as evolution operates on any adaptive system, okay? So again, to kind of approach the idea of anti-memetics, what we're going to do is immediately begin to problematize certain memetic behavior. And we do that through some key parameters and adaptive tendencies of memes, okay? So we're going to look at the way they survive and propagate and compete with each other. So they can do this. One way is through, affording a low cognitive cost, right? They can provide simplistic information that's easy to understand, right? As opposed to something complicated and difficult to wrap your head around, right? They also can appeal, they have effective appeal to possibly to base instincts, right? Information which provides quick dopamine release via triggering conflict and fear. And I want to take a quick moment at this point to highlight this idea of affect theory. It's sort of a broad and expansive theoretical field. People kind of throw this word affect around loosely, but for our purposes, we're going to think of it as describing emotion, often at the threshold of consciousness, that emerges and proliferates through collective intersubjective relations. If you're familiar with Raymond Williams' notion of structures of feeling, it's a little similar to that. It's kind of a pre-articulate feeling. Affects are like a communicative emotional field, which you step into more so than you self-generate. So it's kind of like you're wading into and through this emotional water that we intersubjectively create, right? And so memes can tap into this emotional field for survival and transmissions. They appeal to it, okay? So here's some great examples. These are just two little memes that I think are incredible pieces of information, and they're gonna help us kind of like just get on the same page here and just kind of understand like what's at stake. And so these are both what I would call like normative social coordination memes. And the first one we have, right, the classic treat others as you'd like to be treated. And so this survives clearly by the parameter of affording a low cognitive cost. It's very easy to understand. It's easy to process. We don't need, the Kantian, the sort of elaborate deontological justification for the categorical imperative version of this idea, right? We don't need all that philosophical elaboration. We get everything we need in this little gem here, right? It's a great sort of equalizer. It's very unifying and fair. And it happens to be a great method, a great kind of heuristic for solving the prisoner's dilemma, if you're familiar with that concept. Okay, so we're gonna contrast this meme here with another incredible piece of information, an amazing meme. It's not my job to educate you. Okay, so this also survives by affording low cognitive cost. You kind of get it right away, but it also has this affective appeal here. If you've ever seen this used sort of in the wild, so to speak, it's definitely appeals to like a sense of like conflict and division. It's often used in this pretty contemptuous way. I would say kind of backhanded. And it's divisive, I think, in the sense that there's a literal division of labor implied in this meme, right? Like it's someone's job to educate, but not the speakers, right? So the idea behind this meme is like the oppressed members of society shouldn't shoulder the whole burden of educating their oppressors about oppression, which is totally valid. We can all get behind that, I think. But the problem here is the affect, the sentiment, right? There's a spirit, there's a feeling to this. The way it's used, it's pretty antagonistic and divisive. So those are my examples of memes. We thought it might be a good idea at this point to invite people in the audience, like to offer some ideas of memes in the chat. Ryan, what do you think about that?
Great. Yeah. So we've just provided 2 examples of memes that you might hear kind of commonly. So if you want to just type in the chat, what are examples of other memes or these little slogans or phrases or hashtag comments that you hear? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Great.
Nice.
YOLO. If you're not with us, you're against us. Great. What goes around comes around. Facts versus feelings. Excellent. All these little punchy, catchy NPC non-playable character.
Nice.
Nice. Yeah, the NPC diss.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Chad Stacy. Yeah.
Karen,
Totally.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome.
Cool. Okay. Are we good, Ryan? Should I
go ahead.
Okay. So another way that memes survive and compete is that they can be sort of stronger together in a sense. So they survive by symbiotically, we can say clustering with other compatible or complementary memes. And the technical term for this, Dawkins called it a memeplex. Recently, it's become sort of, people refer to it as an egregore. I think it's fair to sort of equate those. And some examples of a memeplex, right? A clustering of memes. You can think of religions, right? The Abrahamic religions are now competitive species of memeplexes that happen to have like a common ancestor, right? And some distant polytheistic thing, right? So also ideologies, political parties, Republicans, that's a memeplex. Democrats, there's a memeplex there. They compete. And also broader cultural paradigms are memeplexes. You can think like this idea of the spirit of the age or the Geist, right? Liberal democracy is just a cluster of memes that outcompeted another cluster of memes known as monarchy. Okay. And the last thing I'll kind of note about this idea is that memeplexes tend to cohere and are bounded by shared values and goals of the individuals until they don't, right? And you might tend to get, like, again, going back to the speciation, right, of the Abrahamic religions, you end up getting differentiation, okay, eventually. So a memeplex, this clustering phenomenon, is an emergent property of collective intelligence via distributed cognition. Okay, so this is cognitive science stuff here. We're gonna break this down, right, in complexity science and blah, blah. So let's emergence. This is when the whole is greater than the parts, right? Our economy supposedly has this, the invisible hand of our economy. It's an emergent property, right? There's no central design that causes this invisible hand to seek equilibrium. It's just something that happens, right? And so collective intelligence then is shared or group intelligence that emerges from the collaboration, collective efforts, and competition of individuals. And a great example of collective intelligence is Wikipedia, right? And finally, distributed cognition is the phenomenon which allows us to share information and think collectively. And to do this, we need interfacing minds and shared attention, right? But we also use technology as part of distributed cognition. We use writing, books, computers, objects of art and music, and many artifacts of the environment around us are all part of distributed cognition. And so what this allows is for an increased productive capacity and efficiency of information processing at scale, right? By dividing up tasks and cooperating, we accomplish things collectively that a single individual mind could not pull off. And this happens via, right, a division of cognitive labor and specialization. And these things permit a local, or essentially an individual decomplexification, right? They allow one person to think less because others are collectively thinking more. But again, we're problematizing this phenomenon. So we're going to point out that this division and specialization is a slippery slope to over-specialization, we might say, a kind of intellectual de-skilling. For example, you know, when our political party or church does our thinking for us. And I want to just hold on this for a moment here. I think hopefully some of you are kind of recognizing terms from like economic theory, right? Specialization is a key form of adaptation. When we trade the fruits of our specialized knowledge to facilitate greater production as a collective, right? Like division of labor. These are the same terms that we use in economics because it's the same phenomenon acting on a different substrate. And so this is not a metaphor or analogy, okay? And it's actually often a catalytic process, like in relation to the same economic phenomenon of division of labor and specialization. Okay, so what I'm proposing is that the way an economic division of labor allows me to specialize and trade the fruits of my labor at the cost of my own de-skilling, insofar as, for example, I might specialize as a musician and therefore not know how to build a house or make my clothes because other people specialize in those skills for me. So does my memeplex use division of cognitive labor such that I might not understand anything about the dynamics of international immigration or the immigrant experience or the inner workings of our healthcare system, but I can still support certain immigration and healthcare policies because my memeplex does this thinking for me, okay? So this idea of de-skilling through the memeplex is buttressed by what's called the illusion of understanding. And this is a term, it was originally called illusion of depth of explanation, but illusion of understanding, it's been kind of transformed into that idea. So these cognitive scientists here have explored it in depth, and I'm going to quote Sloman and Fernbach. One implication of the naturalness with which we divide cognitive labor is that there's no sharp boundary between one person's ideas and knowledge and those of other members of the team. And so the specialization is actually obscured. It's sort of invisible. We don't notice it. So we live with the belief that we understand more than we do. And this is because we rely so often and so instinctively on other people's expertise all throughout our lives, right? And we have for so long as a species. Presumably we evolved this function along with language. So our reliance on others and our ignorance is invisible to us. And this phenomenon can, of course, increase polarization, right? So when members of the same memeplex don't actually know much, but share a common belief that isn't very well informed, they actually reinforce each other's illusion of understanding, and this support from the group increases polarization. Their beliefs become more extreme as part of a memeplex. And to continue this idea of extremism, opening memetic pipelines to extremism, we're going to get to an example. Okay, so someone who is pathologically prone or vulnerable to extremist beliefs and action can plug into a larger cognitive process. Let's say this person has an interest in men's rights activism and status-based hierarchies, which might eventually find them plugged into the alt-right memeplex, for example. And so the memeplex begins to perform all the more rational, or what's called Overton window thinking for them, and they begin to specialize at the extreme. Okay, and so we have, at this point, we've kind of looked at the common pitfalls of the strategies of memetic adaptation, right? This clustering together and specialization allows more cognitive labor to get done at scale, and we can trade our specialized knowledge, right? But this phenomenon obscures ignorance and de-skilling at a local individual level and increases polarization. Okay, Ryan, do you want to add anything to that? Shall I just keep going? What do you think?
No, great. You can keep going.
Awesome. Okay. So we've problematized memetic behavior, and we're kind of going to approach this idea now from the other side, anti-memetics. Information which does not readily propagate has a kind of, you can think of it as a low or no virality, might be anti-memetic. Things like passwords, conspiracies, sophisticated philosophical propositions, advanced mathematical proofs, profound spiritual and experiential insights might be considered anti-memes. Things that are trivial, passé, sort of like out of fashion, taboo, secretive, avant-garde, radical, nebulous, or complex, things that require a higher cognitive cost, could be anti-memetic. And finally, I think a great way to think about anti-memetic knowledge is that it's tacit, embodied, and situated. So I'm going to just quickly define situated knowledge so we're all on the same page with this. It's knowledge that is embedded in and affected by the concrete historical, cultural, linguistic, and value context of the knowing person. So I'm going to just put what I hope are kind of like compelling examples forward, just briefly here. Let's consider, so for example, like this idea of maybe there are sacred anti-memes out there, right? Spiritual or psychological experiences so profound and primordial, they can't be represented in language. They require something like art or ritual to be expressed. And so we can think of art and spirituality as vessels of the anti-memetic. It's a kind of phenotypic expression of anti-memes. And so this can take the form of like cult social formations who carry on in hermetic obscurity, performing esoteric knowledge production, eschatological or otherwise. We can think of this as like underground counterculture art and performance milieus, things that are, intentionally non-commercial, working against the mainstream. This is often like where the avant-garde is sort of born in these spaces, right? This is a form of anti-memetic production and consumption. And I'm going to let Ryan jump in here to talk about his logo.
The one thing, really just going back to last slide really quickly, TJ.
Yeah.
Just to clarify with conspiracies, what we mean by conspiracies being anti-memetic are genuine, like real conspiratorial events in which there's a lot of pressures to conceal it or keep it secret, i.e., like from the government, not conspiracy theories, which are highly memetic.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Just wanted to clarify that.
Great.
So I'll just go and say, so this is the logo that was generated for meta-ideological politics that we have on our YouTube channel. And this was created by my friend, Nate Kaufman, who's actually here. Nate conceived of this image, and Nate's brother is a graphic designer, and Nate's brother designed this. So shout out to Nate's brother. And I don't know if Nate, you can actually speak about this, since I think Nate's in Panera Bread right now. But the idea is that we have the American, we have this kind of a image of the American flag in the center, right? So American flag representing the nation state, representing patriotism, representing, in the US in 2023, having an American flag, people think you're some like Trump supporting MAGA, ultra conservative, underrated theory. And we nested it in the Zen Enso, right? The Zen circle, the symbol of enlightenment, of emptiness, right? Of awakening, of luminosity. So that this is kind of an anti-memetic tension, right? So we kind of had that anti-memetic instinct kind of implicitly, and then TJ gave us some of the language to articulate it, which is a very interesting phenomenon that we'll get to later. So that's kind of exploring, how do we hold our politics or ideology, right? The battle for power, etc., in the political realm, in the kind of larger embrace of emptiness, of consciousness, of awareness, right? It's kind of a union of form and emptiness, as they say in Buddhism, and that's kind of the latent kind of impulse or intuition behind us forming this image. And so, thank you, Nate. And Nate, if you want to type in the chat more about if I got that right, or your own take on what this image means to you, you can do that, and I'd be curious to see what you have to say. So in other words, this image, because it's anti-memetic, is not going to be at the level of "Let's go, Brandon" anytime soon, and thank God.
Okay. So anti-memetics then. I'll say one last thing about anti-memes to clarify is that they are transmissible, some, like in certain cases. They can survive by symbiotically clustering with other memes and or adapt through lossy compression or sort of shedding complexity. And this is an adaptive behavior we're going to come back to a lot later. Okay. So anti-memetics is a subfield of memetics, right, which investigates the nature and behavior of anti-memes and cultural dynamic systems. And we do this by looking at sort of descriptively the way anti-memes shape and are shaped by broader social, economic, and technological forces. And then there's sort of a normative side as well, okay, a praxis, you could call it. And the question becomes, well, how do we promote socioepistemic complexity, or in our terms, anti-memetic information processing and sharing, and thereby achieve better social coordination in a fiercely competitive information environment? I think a simple way to formulate this question is, how can we ensure the survival of like pro-social anti-memes, for example, which might otherwise be easily outcompeted by more transmissible antisocial memes? Ryan, do you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, so the part on social coordination, right, is that memes are excellent at facilitating social coordination within a tribe or within a silo, right? It provides an in-group, out-group organizing function, right? So if someone shares the memes, we know they're in the in-group, and if they don't, then they're out-grouped, right? So memes are very effective at achieving social coordination within small silos. But if you zoom out to a larger scale, we realize that they're very, very bad at promoting coordination and cooperation between groups or between silos. And that's where some of the anti-memetic complexity work that we'll get into later can kind of show, and I've used these theories in my own work with countering extremism, uplifting individuals who have more socio-epistemic complexity to bridge between groups and to achieve social coordination at a larger scale, and not only within a siloed little container.
Great. And yeah, we're going to come back to a lot of this later and flesh it out and elaborate. Okay. So we're going to take this setup, this rough idea of memes and anti-memes, and we're going to use it to analyze the current cultural climate of polarization here. I call this the infodemic and the health of the information system. The infodemic is this obvious quantitative increase in information the explosion of digital content and information sharing, as well as a qualitative diversification of this information, right? There's just more memes going on, right? Part of that process is that content creation has become a social and economic obligation in a lot of ways. And we can think of this as a technology trap, or kind of, again, this term, a game theoretic trap, or a prisoner's dilemma. We're not going to get too deep into that, but essentially a takeaway here is that it's really increasing the competition for our attention, because there's just so much more information out there to compete with. Part of the health of our information ecosystem is affected by institutional decay, right? Inequality, corruption, obvious societal collapse. These things lead to a lack of trust in sources of information like journalism, government, and science. And this lack of trust has a reinforcing feedback effect in the decay, right? Because these are our shared sort of fictions and social technologies. And the less we trust them, the worse they operate here, right? Also, what's going on is like dramatic semantic shifts around things like gender and race. Like groups are competing for the power to define words. It's often along minority and majority lines, as we would expect. And a good way to kind of summarize this situation that we're presenting, the infodemic, is it's a highly entropic information environment. And we're taking this idea of information entropy from information theory, or it's also known as Shannon entropy. We're not going to get too deep into this here, but so along with like common connotations like thermodynamic entropy, like disorder, chaos, and uncertainty, we also mean here an overwhelming possibility space of knowledge and information. And we have an entropy of both the message space, which is the quantity of information we can receive, and an entropy of the symbol space. So the language and the symbols we use are in rapid flux. And again, that's the semantic shifts around gender and race. Like, what does it mean to be a man or a woman? Like, who can be racist? What does it mean to have race? These things are in entropic flux at the moment, okay? So in this environment of high entropy and increased competition for attention, we get mimetic adaptation, because this environment creates a fitness selection for hypermimetic content that has strong virality to cut through the noise. And memes become what's known as supernormal stimuli. I'm going to define this. It's an important idea here. Supernormal stimuli are communicable exaggerations of everyday stimuli toward which evolutionarily we are easily drawn. So they're often low cognitive cost with quick dopamine reward, and so it's high transmission rates. And they're environmentally fit because they solve this problem of how do we get each other's attention amidst all this noise, right? We're obviating the entropy by establishing a simplistic order. And so we get toxic public discourse, right? Conflict, scandal, antisocial spectacle. Basically, when you think of Twitter, this is what we get, right? Mob mentality, call out, and cancel culture. I'm thinking of like politicians now leaning into their infamy to piss off the other side and fire up their base. It's this sort of any press is good press strategy cranked up to 11, right? We get a ubiquity of ultimatums, this now or never existential urgency in memes. Memes like all cops are bastards. This is in Florida. This is where woke goes to die. We're going to abolish whiteness, right? These are what's interesting about the ultimatums is that they're often, though not always, rooted in complex, more anti-memetic ideas that point towards symptoms of real systemic problems. but they have adapted by shedding complexity for quick triggering and catastrophizing aggression. And I'm going to quote the great British philosopher here, Samuel Ludford, has put this so brilliantly. He says, much of the toxicity of contemporary debate seems to result from placing structuralist, that is systemic, ideas in humanist frames. So we end up kind of hating the sinner instead of just the sin. That's what's going on here with these ultimatums. Algorithmic optimization for bias, addiction, which escalates the echo chamber effect. This is what's known as limbic capitalism. And that's when social media platforms like Facebook and whatnot compete for our attention, and they succeed by, again, maximizing dopamine response. And they do this, right? Dopamine response, that becomes a sort of addictive, right? And they do this by appealing to like what triggers us and appealing to our biases, right? And so we end up being fed like more fake news, alternative facts, more mis and disinformation, things that again appeal to our biases here. Okay. So we're going to look closely now at some similar cultural dynamics that specifically govern identity politics. And this should give us, like, I think, a better understanding of the information ecosystem and the sort of damage that we're looking at here. So this is because, again, we're going back to this idea of over-specialization. So a correlated adaptive response to fitness constraints of high entropy and high competition environment would be increased specialization. In this case, the ascent of identity politics as our dominant coordinational meme plexus. People tightly organize around categories of race and gender. They mimetically over-specialize in these categories because of the shared values, right? That embedded tacit knowledge, so the shared values and similar lived experience found within those identity realms. As well as the attentive response from a liberal pluralistic society that's sensitive to the plights of minoritarian and intersectional disenfranchisement under white supremacy. So I want to clarify here for a moment. I'm not trying to delegitimize minoritarian oppression and disenfranchisement. These are very real, totally valid things that are happening. But what we are doing is highlighting problematic mimetic tendencies of this form of social coordination in our current information ecosystem, right? Because these identity tags like race and gender are the simplest and most straightforward means of social coordination and political organizing. They're historically tried and true, for better or worse, right? There's a kind of primordial tribalism at work here. It provides that, like Ryan was saying, there's an easy sense of in-group affiliation and out-group differentiation. And this really, it comes down to obviating entropy, information entropy, by establishing a simplistic familiar order. And so what we're going to do is we're going to think about identity politics as a form of what Max Boisseau calls clan culture. And so, as Ryan was stating before, clan culture facilitates that embodied shared knowledge. It can be anti-memetic information sharing, right? It can be tacit, embodied, situated knowledge. That's why people seek it. It facilitates what we could say internal complexity, right? But the problem is that clan culture is within market culture. Market culture is the superordinate culture, right? Encompassing interactivity between clans. And market culture selects for explicit, highly mimetic compression of information, right? For cheap, efficient, and instantaneous diffusion at scale. And it's a highly competitive thing going on here. And so clan knowledge must contend with market culture in order to scale. for clans to speak amongst themselves, they go through the market, okay? Societies under free market capitalism are subject to pervasive market parameters like efficiency, immediacy, competition, and surplus value production. In this sense, markets work as a centripetal force acting on wider cultural value systems, including clan culture, right? Such that social values and knowledge are pulled into and filtered through market mechanisms where they're subjected to its adaptive constraints, right? That fitness selection there. So when knowledge is transmitted between clans, there's a shedding of complexity. There's a lossy compression of information because their signals are going through market parameterization first. Thus, anti-memetic situated knowledge within clans is transformed into memetic, impersonal, cheap, marketized knowledge during transmission. So it becomes broadcast at scale as marketized knowledge. And this effect will in turn feed back into and contaminate clan culture. And this process is doubly problematic in conjunction with the hyper-memification we've already attributed to the infodemic, right? This is nasty. Okay. So
oh, sorry, go ahead, TJ.
No, go ahead, Ryan.
I'll just say one example of where this has been very frustrating in my work is that part of the localized, specialized clan knowledge means that the knowledge of a certain community is locally embodied, and so that the idea is that that community has the best sense of how to fix their own problems and what to do, right? This is the argument for federalism in the US, for localism, for subsidiarity, et cetera. But when this dynamic that TJ is showing us occurs, it kind of retards the intelligence of the local community because they no longer are looking at the unique problems that they're experiencing on their own unique terms. They're filtering it through a kind of memified lens that's universalized through market mechanisms. So when I talk to people on the ground and say, hey, what's going on in your community? They regurgitate memetic talking points that everyone else on their ideological side in the US says, and are not going to the specific problems in their community. And that's obviously largely engendered from the internet and social media, but it's a very problematic thing when you're working at a kind of community organizing local level, and you can't get the specific knowledge from that clan or group or community because they're just repeating talking points that they heard on Twitter.
Awesome. Yeah. And so what this clan knowledge ends up looking like when broadcast then is a centralized and weaponized identity politics, right? This is just more toxic public discourse. The selection for simplistic, cheap, market-ready memes, as Ryan said, leads to discourse meant to trigger and incite anger. Again, I'll bring up that the meme from the beginning, it's not my job to educate you, right? There's this sort of antagonistic affect there. And we get in, again, this is another multipolar trap situation, which Daniel Schmachtenberger touches on a lot. This is game theory and prisoner's dilemma stuff. We get this arms race of dehumanizing culture war propaganda. So for example, like one team says, oh, you guys are all Nazi fascists. And then the rejoinder is, well, you guys are all pedophile groomers. And then team one says, well, we're going to abolish whiteness. And then the other team says, well, we're going to eradicate transgenderism. Right? It's this escalating, like very much towards violence. I think it's fairly clear here. So these are memes that are selected for their perceived aggression and capacity to incite animosity and even violence, regardless of whatever pro-social intent or sort of like sound theory is behind them. When I think about a centralized and weaponized identity politics, I also think of sort of this culture of petty grievance, particularly like the microaggression meme, where we become hesitant to like say ask where someone is from because we don't want to offend them. That kind of like interminable fear generating memetics. Another issue here is what we would call memetic inbreeding. This is when the discourse discourse becomes rational only within the bounds and confines of our echo chamber. You can think of it as like, so in-group chains of logic, reasoning, and jargon succumb to a kind of insularity, such that when their memes are outputted, they sound totally absurd. Like, for example, abolish whiteness. There's a sound theory behind that, but its output, it's nonsensical, or it just sounds like hateful, right? I think we could say that conspiracy theory culture, like QAnon, would be an example of this. It's a kind of siloing or in-group reasoning that becomes like highly idiosyncratic, we'll say. Ryan, do you want, I know Ryan had some really interesting sort of in the field examples of this as well.
Well, people are literally speaking different languages.
Yeah.
And when someone says something, whether it would be like QAnon's like where we go one, we go all, and certain things on the far left are said, certain thing, right? Everyone else is like, what the hell are you talking about, right? It makes sense to that little echo chamber. Everyone else is completely baffled what you're talking about, and you sound like a crazy person, right? There's a kind of cultification, a kind of iterative cultification of each echo chamber, and
Right.
that becomes more and more tailored and siloed to that community, and everyone else is completely baffled by what you're saying. And so even I've been in mediations where even if people fully intended to understand each other, they could not understand each other in spite intending to understand each other. Even good faith wasn't enough to bridge the gap. And that's part of the problem. It's an information problem, not only a bad faith problem.
Yeah, very well put. Great. Another phenomenon here would be what we would call recursive niche construction. This again is part of we can think of it as adaptation via over specialization, but we get reinforcing feedback loops of attention that lead to factional capture. Okay, so this is when other members of the wider memeplex or coalition, let's say the liberal left, for example, note the attention garnered by certain identitarian tactics and grievances, and they borrow the playbook, so to speak, and attempt to differentiate along their own lines of grievance, which leads to this recursive factional capture. Factional in the sense of a disintegration of the broader coalition or memeplex due to infighting. And we can think of this as being similar, right, to that speciation happening to Abrahamic monotheism. That memeplex sort of dissolved into these competing memeplexes, right? Of Christianity, Islam, etc. And it continues to do so to this day, right? Denominationally, etc. Oh, and this example here, right on the left, TERF versus trans, people like unable to kind of cohere as a broader memeplex or coalition because of these intensified, amplified differences of grievance. And so these processes of adaptation, as well as the infodemic situation, which we outlined before, are very much defining our affective landscape, that emotional sort of field or water that we wade into. And that in turn influences, it further influences memetic adaptation. Okay. So to kind of summarize what we've been problematizing here is that the infodemic has helped to foster a hypermemetic race to the bottom of the brainstem with all this simple, easy to process, simplistic information with quick, easy dopamine release that ends up escalating polarization and increasing ideological constriction. And by that, we mean like that lack of ideological diversity and complexity. There's like, it's a homogenization as well, a polarized homogenization due to rigidification. We can think of that. It's an inhospitable environment for anti-memes and complex thinking, right? And we can imagine it as analogous maybe to the cultural turmoil and eventual European wars of religion set off by the Gutenberg press. Here, the Gutenberg press would be analogous to the internet. You get this explosion of memes and information that completely radically upsets the entire cultural order, and it potentially leading to great violence, right? So the question becomes, right, how do we promote a healthier, more anti-memetic information ecology? Another question, we're gonna sort of let this question hang for a moment, as well as another things like how can we think about limiting or bypassing those market constraints, that centripetal market force, right? And we will come back to that. So, all right. So we're well beyond the halfway point here. We're going to start looking at solutions, orientations, answering these questions. We've problematized the process of memification of culture. So what we're going to do, we're going to return to a more value neutral framework here for a balanced perspective, because becoming memetic, like a meme, is not a categorically bad thing, right? Information happens to develop bidirectionally, right? It can be anti-memetic, it can become memetic, and it can go the other way. And so we're going to look at this process of anti-memetic information developing and becoming memetic, which we have done. We've just been problematizing it, but we're going to look at it now in a positive light here. We can think of this as a downstream process, right? The anti-memetic sort of evolves or devolves, we could say, into the memetic. The tacit becomes explicit and the complex becomes simplified. I want to highlight this word tacit, right? This is knowledge. We've used it a couple of times, but just to be clear, it's knowledge that defies explicit articulation, right? That which one knows but cannot say. It's often highly context specific and embedded. But this becomes memified, right? There's a compression effect. And so we lose complexity when it becomes memetic. I'm going to let, so we're getting back to Boisseau here. I'm going to let Ryan take this. Ryan, diffusion of information via codification and abstraction. What do you got?
Yeah, so just very briefly, so Boisseau is was a British knowledge management theorist who said that in order for information to diffuse or go viral and spread virally, it needs to be codified and abstracted. So it needs to be made explicit. It needs to be simplified into unifying abstraction, and there needs to be enough distinctions or differences articulated first, and then those differences are consolidated into the abstractions, right? And so the example that he gives is like a price signal in the market. Price signals instantly diffuse, and these bond traders are looking at these different numbers and making trades and trying to score a profit based on very readily diffusible viral information, which is a price signal or market signal that facilitates market coordination. The exact opposite of that is the Zen master. And Boisseau says the Zen master, the knowledge is very tacit. The kind of Zen, Satori or Kensho or enlightenment experience is something that cannot diffuse like a price signal. You can't, there's all these Zen koans and phrases of like, you can't put it into words. You have to sit, you have to be with the teacher, you have to infuse some of it via transmission, you got to get it tacitly, you got to practice. And so that's why Zen focuses so much on paradox and contradiction as a kind of tool of spiritual awakening, because you can't codify and abstract your way to enlightenment, right? So Boisseau kind of lays that out in a very humorous way that really gets to the difference between the very anti-memetic, unarticulable, and the highly memetic, very explicit, very articulable. And one type of information spreads very quickly, and the other one really does not spread easily at all.
Excellent. Here we go with another example. You want to take this, Ryan?
Yeah, I'll just say briefly. So this is Miranda Fricker is a British feminist theorist, one of my favorite feminist theorists, and she has a concept called epistemic justice. And there's also epistemic injustice. And epistemic and justice and injustice is broken down into two categories. There's testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. So the latter is what I find the most interesting. Hermeneutic injustice is when in a society, a certain group suffers from a certain form of oppression because there's no word to capture that oppressive dynamic. And her canonical example is sexual harassment. So before the 50s and 60s, before sexual harassment became a part of normal conversation, before sexual harassment became codified as a meme that everyone understands, if a woman experienced sexual harassment in the workplace, she would have to speak for hours trying to articulate what happened, the impact it had on her, the psychological and relational influences, how that was occurring in the workplace. But now a woman can say, oh, I was sexually harassed, and everyone knows what that means, and we can do something about it. You can file a complaint with HR. It's all very codified and systematized, and so that's a good thing in the sense that oppressive dynamic can hide behind the nebulosity of the anti-memetic. However, of course, if that goes too far, you have what's called concept creep. There's a proliferation of concepts that get more and more kind of neurotic in a sense. And you oversimplify the complexities of the issue. And so I think this tension was really revealed in the whole Me Too movement and the Me Too hashtag, right? It's like there is a dynamic that's being called out, but how do we do it without oversimplifying the complexities of each individual's experience with that phenomena? That can then lead to canceling and all kind of cultural pathologies. So that's kind of the balance we're trying to strike here.
Awesome. Okay, so yeah, there's our sort of proof of anti-memetic becoming memetic for the greater good, right? So we're gonna go the other way now. How does the memetic become anti-memetic? This, of course, in contrast to a downstream, this is an upstream process. It's more difficult. This is when the explicit seeks the sort of tacit nebulous origins, right? We're going back to the ineffable, the complicated, the sort of continuous as opposed to the discrete. And the simple becomes re-complexified. So how can we do this? How can we pull this off? And a couple of ideas Ryan and I talk a lot about. You can think of this idea of retrodiction. So memetic retrodiction, inferring the evolutionary origins of memes and memeplexes. And retrodiction is the explanation or interpretation of past actions or events inferred from the laws that are assumed to govern them presently. And a great example of retrodiction is, in fact, the theory of evolution itself. Right? You're predicting about how these things in the past turned out the way they did. And so again, we use retrodiction to sort of rediscover the nebulous, complex, and obscured foundations of our ideas, the anti-memes that were perhaps effectively lost during their adaptation to transmissible memes. Another concept here, creative abduction. Similar, it's you're getting back to this sort of root of things. You're reframing the causal forces at the root of the meme or argument. Be a new framework of superior and more precise and accurate explanation. Okay, and so we're gonna elaborate on these via a couple of examples here. We've got Nietzsche, of course, right? The genealogical method, right? Where he looks back at the history of Christianity, the origins, the roots, and he says, this is not about good behavior. This is about weakness, right? He calls Christianity a slave morality. And we're not trying to argue that he's right here, but this is just an example of historical retrodictive analysis, seeming to kind of divulge or uncover an anti-meme at the roots of Christianity. I think of it almost as like he's dealing with a form of encryption, but in a way, it's a kind of re-encryption, insofar as at the time of his analysis, this idea of Christianity as a slave morality was very anti-memetic, right? He died more or less in obscurity, right? Okay. The next one, exemplifying more abduction. I'm going to let Ryan take this one. This comes from a phenomenal book called, this is the thesis of a book called The Origins of Unfairness. Ryan, why don't you go ahead and take this example of creative abduction?
Sure. So this book is from an author named Kaylin O'Connor, and basically in her book, The Origins of Unfairness, she does a evolutionary game theoretic analysis of how social inequalities emerge. And so the reason why I look at it as a good example of creative abduction is that her analysis basically states that um, people coordinating, or I should say, people creating categories for people like black, white, man, woman, etc., are actually advantageous in some ways for the group doing that, creating these kind of categories that we can be stereotyped into because they allow for efficient coordination. So societies will select for the tendency to create categories as a kind of game theoretic selection pressure. And so if we're trying to undo some of the damage caused by these kind of rigid categorizations of our identity, we have to take that into consideration and work against that accordingly. That's a much more causally precise and also falsifiable way of exploring how inequality or oppression occurs instead of just saying hashtag crush the patriarchy. That's very like right. So that kind of like woke or SJW kind of meme is very causally imprecise and is very vague. And so creative abduction is taking a set of memes, putting them into a new framework where the causal mechanisms driving that outcome can be much more precise and much more accurate, so that as we're trying to do something about it, we can go about really doing it in the most helpful way instead of kind of recklessly, memeing ourselves to a completely polarized society. So, so to me, the normative aspect of creative abduction is to reframe a meme or ideology or a certain line of argumentation in light of a new framework that gives it superior explanatory value.
Awesome. I'm going to let you keep going here with titanium manning. This is
Yeah.
this is your meme here.
I guess this is my meme, right? So the titanium manning is just one step above steel manning. So you re-articulate the argument that someone made it in an even more powerful, more complex, more multidimensional way than they originally articulated it, right? And often this involves creative abduction or plugging someone's argument into a superior framework that offers more explanatory depth. So that's a tool that can be used to kind of inject more anti-memeticness into something that's very bastardized and memeified, to kind of extract more value from it, right? So it's more in an integral sense, it's more than just seeing the bit of truth within the argument. You upgrade the argument to then get more value out of it. So you modify a certain perspective to get more value out of it. What else do we have here, TJ?
All right. So we're gonna we've earlier we pretty heavily problematized specialization and adaptation via specialization and over specialization. So we're going to consider, as part of like anti-memetic praxis, the alternative of generalization and diversification. We're thinking here like an expansion of our perspective to better facilitate complex anti-memetic knowledge. And the first point here is this is a concept that I love. It's very dear to me. It's a little counterintuitive, maybe at first. Let me try to explain it. So negative capability. This was coined by the poet John Keats in the early 19th century. He says, negative capability is a writer's ability which Shakespeare possessed so enormously to accept uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And I think of negative capability as a sort of prerequisite skill building technique or vibe or mood for adaptive generalization. Because in order to really, truly philosophically diversify, we have to be able to hold contradictory truths in mind. We have to be able to sit with the tension of opposites, right? This is very anti-memetic mentality. I think of it as a cognitive superpositional state in a sense. And so Keats is kind of pointing out Shakespeare is the consummate generalist, right? His work was often like exploring these oppositional tensions, okay, through characters, theme, plot, at all levels. He was very interested in the pull and tension of opposites. Also part of this generalization process, ideological and anthropological exploration, right? It's about seeking out and taking on the perspective of the ideological other and an exposure to unique and challenging ontologies of other cultures, which subject us to what would otherwise be highly anti-memetic or unthinkable concepts, right, within our own everyday experience. We're kind of moving outside our Overton windows. And an Overton window here, this is an important, this is a term which defines the spectrum of acceptable ideas for government policy. That's where this term comes from. But we can even think of it more generally, just thinkable, sensible, rational ways of structuring the world, the way we do this. Well, we can, when we explore ideologically and anthropologically, we broaden our Overton window, okay? And finally, part of this process is we're recognizing, right, our biases and blind spots. You know, we're off, like myself, I'm sure many people here, we're part of that weird demographic, right? The Western educated, industrial rich democracy. And that comes with innate presumptions and biases. And by anthropologically exploring other cultures and perspectives, we get a better sense of that. And this, we get a better sense of kind of like, when we look at both sides of the debate, we get a fuller understanding of the issues at stake here. That's this idea of an emerging totality of complex issues and problems when we look at both sides, when we diversify and generalize. Okay.
TJ, just really quickly.
Yeah.
I have a hard stop in 20 minutes. And
okay. Yeah.
I want to leave enough time for Q&A and for people to engage in dialogue. Do you think we can blitz through 21 and 22 and then end?
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah.
So we've got anti-memetic network engineering. We can think, one thing I'll touch on here, constraining public discourse, things like censorship through social norms and regulations, even limiting free speech. This is actually one way we can begin to limit some of that market parameterization. We can obviate the market fitness and adaptation constraints within clan culture by having stronger communicative norms against essentialism and weaponization. We can constrain the way knowledge spread and information and means spread through networks. And we've got two ideas here from the bottom coming from network science proper. We're talking about like, Ryan, do you want to, how about you take boosting the signal of diversity connected to bridger nodes?
Sure, yeah. Do you want to show the diagram on the next? So this idea has really informed my work. So in network theory, there are 4 types of what are called centrality analysis, which is to measure how different nodes in the network connect or have connections with other nodes in the network. And so this diagram is depicting something called betweenness centrality. So that B node in the center there is high in betweenness centrality. Betweenness centrality means that it's a node where a lot of edges run through as their shortest point, meaning that that node is usually in the middle of different clusters of nodes and of different edges. So they can kind of act as a bridging agent in a community or between communities. I think Karen used a term somewhere way back up in the chat of like bards or something, people going between communities. And I like that term. This is kind of the B person in the middle. And so in my work, I've had to hunt for these unicorns and find people who are uniquely ideologically positioned between communities that don't have any connections with each other, and using their credibility and influence with these disparate communities to help depolarize and de-escalate and even bring some of these different communities together. Now, the drawback of the B person is that they're socially anti-memetic, right? So a lot of times what I hear from these people is, I'm lonely, man. I don't have any friends. I'm a political nomad or political couch surfer, right? I can kind of ideologically vibe with a little bit of some, from each school or each camp, but I myself am not all in on one. And so it's a little lonely being out in the middle. And I'm like, great, these are the people we need to boost. These are the people we need to uplift. Some studies even insinuate that the majority of Americans hold something like this as independence or something, but we just don't hear about them because the discourse is drowned out by the loudest, partisan voices. And so my question is, how do we find these people both in the real world and use them to kind of bridge communities on the ground? And in terms of network engineering and in terms of social media and so forth, how do we find platforms or YouTubers or other people who are able to bridge across between communities who may not have the largest following, may not have the most followers on Twitter or YouTube subscribers, but they nonetheless have a bridging role between communities, and can find common ground in which there seems to be none at this point. And like this the guy that we've hired, it may not even be based on ideology, but they may bridge based on another common theme. Like the guy that I'm working with is a gun expert. And through being an expert on guns, he has a lot of connections with the far left and the far right, and with militia groups on both sides that he's able to connect with, not necessarily on their ideology, but around guns. So the kind of like this bridger roles and working with them to exert a positive influence across silos.
Okay. Briefly, we're going to just mention anti-memetic neuroscience here. We can think of this as local memetic disruption, like sort of self-work. I'm gonna touch on functional noise. It's pretty interesting. If anyone wants to take a screenshot here of neural annealing, if you want to look into like Carl Friston's active inference and the free energy principle, you can do that on your own. It's very interesting. But I'm gonna take functional noise here. So functional noise, a concept from neuroscience. So it's something like dreaming avoids overfitting of the brain, which leads to overfitting, which leads to failures in generalization and poor performance on novel data sets. The theory is that nightly dreams evolve to combat the brain's tendency to overfit during its daily learning. Dreams are a biological mechanism for increasing generalizability via the creation of corrupted sensory inputs from stochastic activity across the hierarchy of neural structures. And so my proposition here is that more than just dreams, we can think of art, extended meditation, psychedelics as all functioning as part of this functional noise. And I want to quickly quote again Boisseau, who we've referenced a number of times. There's a really similar idea here, but he's coming from a completely different place. It's not neuroscience, it's from organizational theory. He's talking about sort of bureaucracy. He says too much time in the ordered regime eventually leads to fossilization and an inability to respond to phenomena outside a very narrow range. Okay, and so the last slide here, we're going to think about artificial, synthetic memetics, artificial intelligence as distributed cognition, which we talked about how technology is a medium by which we think collectively, and AI is clearly poised to become a radically powerful and maybe even a dominant component in this process of distributed cognition. So some possible negatives of that, right? AI as a generative memetic agent, it's called automated influence operations, like geopolitical memetic warfare. We can think of Russian troll bots or something like that. There's also dead internet theory. I'm not going to go into that. And okay, so AI, right, this is a great example of the infodemic. Again, it could just be an escalation, right, of this explosion, this overwhelming entropy of information. Okay, so these are some problems here. And solutions can happen potentially via alignment, right? This is sort of AI safety research. We can find solutions in requiring proof of personhood for people online. It's a very complicated process, but we can also think of like these language models potentially as a kind of anti-memetic augmentation for better sense making and information processing at scale without increased bureaucracy, right? That's a huge drain on energy and resources. And so without increased bureaucracy or without it sacrificing complexity. So we can think of it as neutrality in this alignment process, AI being aligned to human values. Perhaps neutrality and nuance are sort of baked in to these language models via their training. And just a couple of brief examples here. So Daniel Schmachtenberger has touted the work of someone named John Ash and the Cognisys project, And you can actually interact with a sort of prototype of this sort of AI on Twitter. You can tweet with it. And finally, in Romania recently unveiled a new honorary AI government advisor called Ion. So those are just some examples of how that's already happening. And so, yeah, that's the end of our presentation here. Here are a couple of, this is both, if you want to take a screenshot here, this is both like a follow-up reading and also a bit of a bibliography. These works by Lehman, The Spirit of Anti-Memetics, and The Social Construction and Anti-Memes by Samuel Ludford were responses to some of the work I was doing. They're both incredible, and they really expand the idea of what an anti-memetic practice can be like. And yeah, again, you can kind of follow up on the rest of this as you see fit. At the bottom is where you can find some of my writing, and that's my email. If you want to reach out, if you have any questions or want to talk anti-memetics, I'm up for it. So yeah, Ryan?
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I know that was a ton of information.
Yeah.
Kind of per the theme of our presentation. So I'd love to, I was monitoring the chat, loved a lot of the comments and questions, so hope to dig in there. TJ, if you want to just stop sharing your screen, and we can also send anyone the slides and information on the slides too.
Yeah. I was not looking at the chat, I just want to say, so I just sort of just was caught up in the actual presentation. So I'll just put that out there. I was not watching the chat, but I will take a look at it.
Awesome. So yeah, does anyone want to jump? I have to leave in 9 minutes. I hope you all can stay longer. Yeah, Karen. Hi, Karen.
Hey, hi, Ryan. So good to see you again too. Yeah, wow. Yeah. I'm a cultural historian by training, and I have analyzed the various stages of human cultural evolution from the origin of our species. And I have analyzed it into 6 separate eras. For those of you who are Gebserians, I break Gebser's mental into 3 separate stages. And I chart as we have brought forth levels of human culture of increasing complexity. I announced 6 very specific analyzable stages where you can take the various arenas of human knowledge, and you see there's a specific difference for each of the 6 phases of human culture. Archaic, magic, mythic, then traditional, modern, postmodern, as these are divided by periods of great chaos and turbulence. They're phase changes, punctuations in the punctuate. Right. Okay. Now, according to my analysis, every one of those periods of punctuation, of chaotic transition, is an infodemic escalation. There is a significant change in the mode of communication, like to begin with language, then more complicated language, then writing, then the printing press, then radios, TVs, etc., then the internet, and now we have social media. These have increased the chaos at each one of these phase changes, and we are now in the middle of number 7 in human history. So to point out, I love so many of these terms. Infodemic escalation. Basically, my message based on my analysis of big history is that we have seen this movie 6 times before in human history. Nice. It's not new, and the people who will thrive at this next level are the people who can self-regulate at the level that you have described in your in your analysis at a very high level of abstraction. These are people who can modulate their attention and choose how to and conserve instead of getting drowned by it. This has been the case at all the previous 6 stages. So, yeah, and I love how you analyze it. And wandering bards who can move among, that was my term, who can move among these, and they may not be at home in any, but they share the small, I forget your term, but the small nuggets that will be entertaining to this group from that group. Oh, look at the dance they do over there. Oh, yeah, that's fun. So these connectors are out there, and
I love that.
And
I
that's
would love to respond to this. I absolutely agree. I see this phase transitional atmosphere. I love that. That's a great way to put it. And I think that was partly why I referenced the Gutenberg situation, right? This is because that was followed up by a time of great turmoil and violence.
Yes.
So the question with this phase transition is, can we transition more peacefully?
That is my passion, and that's why I'm involved in groups like this, because with our level of understanding now, can we usher humanity and the planet through this phase change with less suffering rather than more?
Excellent.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. Always great to see you. I think, is it Johan with your hand up?
Hello.
Hey, how's it going?
I was just going to say, I think that network analysis of the bridge node is kind of like we are living in a network age, and you applied the network analysis to see how to maybe have a role that helps us surpass it. And the thing that brought to mind is I was looking at Otto Lasky's dialectical thought forms, and it's a mechanism where you can kind of judge a sort of linguistic performance. We can call it a meme, and have a sense of how to dialectically connect to it. And then there's a specific thought form. I mean, he uses Biscar's 4 moments of dialectic, but he puts it in. So it's context, relation, context, process, relation, transformation. And in each of those categories of thought forms, there's a category called enrichment. And I think it's exactly what you're describing in those bridge nodes, but in various forms of complexity, specifically the transformation enrichment, taking the meme and transforming it. I think that relates to your idea of titanium manning. Very cool, very fascinating stuff. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you so much, Johan. Unfortunately, I have to run. I would love to follow up with you about some of the things you just mentioned. If you want to type it in the chat, and then TJ, if you can capture in the chat and tell me later. I hope you all can continue for a little bit longer with TJ here. I have to teach a mediation class. So thank you so much, everyone. Great to see all of you, and hope to see you again. Thanks for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay. So I see Varun here. Maybe it looks like I'm seeing one more hand. I'm not used to hosting these kind of things, so I'm seeing one.
Right now, there's just one hand up.
Yeah, great. Okay. Do you want to sort of take over this role here?
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you.
Yeah. So hey, TJ. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Didn't understand everything, as the subject matter is quite complex, but what I just want to sort of confirm in my understanding is that basically you were talking about memes, in that they are sort of these cultural sort of like messages or simplifications, like we see on social media, that that sort of spread and simplify an idea. And then anti-memes are sort of memes, but that don't have the same characteristics of spreading as easily. So like more like counterculture movements and underground sort of movements and things like that. So I thought I always see these kind of people who are maybe taking like psychedelics or whatever. I mean, the way they're dressed, and they have a T-shirt that says "Free Your Mind" or something like that. But isn't that a meme? Is that a meme, or like a Matrix kind of thing or something like that? Oh, that is quite mainstream.
Sure, yeah, I would say that's a kind of highly compressed, simplified, memetized representation of a more nuanced, complex process that we would hope to achieve, right? There's definitely, it can definitely be memified, but it comes from a more nuanced, complicated place, I would say. Yeah. Again, I mean, anti-memes, I mean, the concept can hold also the ineffable, the unthinkable, which I think is interesting as well. I mean, we can take it further and talk, more about like ideas that defy language, that can only transmit, I don't know how, by vague pointing, So yeah.
Okay, so that's interesting. That I'm just glad that I understood more or less. And then also I was just thinking, So I know that Richard Dawkins wrote this book, kind of like Viruses of the Mind, which is one of the main starting books I should maybe read on memes. And then basically also a book that comes to mind, I don't know if it's related, but it's like this Malcolm Gladwell wrote this book called The Tipping Point or something like that, where he talks about like sort of like the different kinds of people or ways that ideas spread. And so I'm thinking, is that related as well? And I was trying to think of it from maybe a marketing kind of point of view, where maybe I can make like social media posts or something where I can try and sell like a coaching service or something like eventually, or something like this. But I was thinking maybe marketing is just like, I don't know anything about marketing, but it's a lot of like ridiculous sort of ideas or like juxtapositions and things like that. But like, I mean, you guys study this more in the realm of sort of political sort of it's more to influence like social change, or
Right.
Interesting question, Varun. Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, so that's
very long-winded. Sorry.
The tipping point is what he's describing is another example of a phase transition within a network. That's what that's another way of sort of articulating a tipping point. It's when the nodes phase transition, right, to another state, where this what might have been a minority bit of perspective or idea or product or trend suddenly becomes the dominant majority
like
trend. And that also leads to that leads to, again, we talked earlier about, like I mentioned, this technology trap of social media. So at some point, you know, social media reached a tipping point. There was a phase transition where we were all kind of obligated to partake. So yeah, that's definitely, that's definitely part of it. Sure. Okay. Phyllis?
I'm calling on myself for a second.
Great.
Thanks. First of all, I was thinking about the idea of being able to complexify memes and how difficult that is, especially in this time that we're living in, where social media is so geared towards sound bites and towards really like lessening our ability to give our attention in any kind of a meaningful way to something that's more, more complex. So that was, one thing that I wanted to mention. And the other thing is, and this is just a weird question. When I went on the web to look to see what anti-memetics was, I got some real weird stuff that talked about memory erasure and I'm just wondering how that fits in. Does it fit in, or is it a completely different thing than what you're talking about?
No, so you're probably thinking of that the memory erasure, that is from a science fiction, an online work of science fiction, like a science fiction novel.
That's what it's reading like, yeah.
There is no anti-memetics division. Right. And that was kind of, they use that term in a very similar way. Right. But it's just, again, it's a work of fiction. There's not a systematic analysis there of anti-memetics, or kind of how to use it to analyze culture and the transmission of information more broadly.
Thank you.
But to your first point, about, you were talking about like trying to preserve complexity.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that comes down to how we can, how can we like work around market parameterization, because we're a market culture, right? We're subject to those centripetal forces of the market that want information and communication to be hyper efficient and transmissible and immediate and easy to process. So we have to kind of retrain ourselves to think about getting around that, or potentially, trying not to be a market culture is another way of talking about that.
The book Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, and the whole idea of heuristics and not allowing ourselves to rely on heuristics. And you also, in your blurb on it, talked about how integral is really like a real good anti-memetic.
Right. Yeah, that's right. Ryan has pointed that out. Yeah. Integral. It's a complex idea that's hard to compress into like the soundbite, right? Yeah. But we want it, presumably we want this kind of information to spread and to share and broadcast at scale. But how do we do that without it becoming parameterized by the market? That's sort of the question, I think. Or even if we have to, how can we do it in a way that maximizes complexity and minimizes like division and antagonism and competition? So, okay.
Johan?
Johan, yeah.
I just want to say that just to call back to my originals here, I think Lasky's model can fit into that inquiry, because it's essentially saying, can we have an operating amount of skillful practitioners that can contextualize very complex things in a moment? And I also wanted to say that I think relative to thinking about ChatGPT relative to the transmission of available information to learn a skill, I think it already does that in a very strange way, in a very particular way, maybe for a certain category of knowledge acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think a lot of, like, for programmers, they have this kind of process where trial and error gets reified in Stack Overflow. And the most popular languages become easier to use via the feedback loop, that because they're the most used, all their problems are surfaced up first. So, and based on that, it creates that term where there's not a depth of understanding, but there's a productivity in the usage. But ChatGPT can kind of give that same quality of information, but for a way more broader set of subjects. And given that, I'm just curious, like, do you think ChatGPT, like, have you tested ChatGPT's ability to do sort of bridging the network, even in a simulated environment? Like, this person said this meme, this person said this meme. What do you think would be a good overlap or touch point that consolidates the two memes? Have you tried that? And do you know people that are testing it for that capacity?
So personally, I haven't explored that deeply at all. I mean, I try to follow a lot of that research and development. I'm very interested in it, but again, the projects that I'm aware of that are the most intentionally interested in like facilitating better sense making through AI and these large language models, it's still very theoretical and like prototype stage kind of stuff. But I do also see what you're seeing. There is as part of what you might call the ontology of these AIs, there is there's kind of what you might call like a disclaimer effect, right? These chatbots love to remind you of their shortcomings when and where they can, right? They'll say, hey, well, I can't really speak to this issue. I have no emotions, et cetera, et cetera. You see this in Bing, for example. They've been trained to disclaim their limits. Now, there are, that doesn't mean, of course, we accept everything from them. But I think that idea of a self-awareness of limits in our communication through each other, as well as from, synthetic artificial forces, I think that's a really interesting kind of another kind of heuristic, like, hey, let's bring in this idea, this like to disclaim the limits of our understanding and our capabilities here.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Eric? Don't hear you.
Sorry, that was my local. Yeah, so thank you very much, TG. I loved this. I loved what Ryan did last time he did this. I hope you folks are on this platform a lot more. I really want to see attention to your work. It's very inspiring for me. And so what I want to do is I appreciate for me this, broader background, and for me to have the the theoretical understandings that underpin my more direct action within a particular arena, which is politics. And so I'm in the United States. I'm interested in seeing a higher level of political discourse. I hate to see the disintegration that we're having right now. And my work is in supporting political candidates who want to bring different sensibilities within that sphere. So if we took all this and we tried to ground it in just some, like what are 3 or 5 takeaways that are more understandable for someone who's not a, integralist type of person, but that would make sense and that would anchor with them, that they could contribute to better dialogue as we try to understand the problems that we're facing in this country, and that hopefully we can support better quality candidates rising to the surface. And there's I'm curious how we go about doing that, and how do we plant seeds with the types of people who are getting some public presence by their fact of running for office, and give them some hints, some hands up to be able to up-level our conversations.
I like that. That's great. The first thing I'll say, I'll just repeat a great nugget of wisdom from Ryan that I started with, which is this kind of project is about, it's not about changing people's beliefs. It's about, changing their relationship to their beliefs, and thereby changing how we relate to each other. So this gets to this, this broad meta mentality of an awareness of the way we think, a reflection back on the way we think and the way we relate to each other. And some sort of important bullet points there. I again, that idea of the illusion of understanding that occurs in sort of groupthink memeplex spaces, I think is something we have to be really aware of, especially in, of course, political realms where the cognitive scientists who I referenced there in that section, they do studies, for example, where they will ask people, to rate their understanding and passion about a certain policy, and then they will have them try to mechanistically explain how that policy would work and the effects it would have on society. And once they try to do that, once they try to make a mechanistic explanation, as opposed to just this well, this is why I support it. Once they try to make that mechanistic explanation, they lose so much confidence in their ideas, and in their passion and extremity drops. Right. So I think, as Ryan would say, a focus on sort of mechanistic reasonings, how things are working out there, how they might work, as opposed to just, well, this is why it's great. It's obviously great because these are my values. There tends to be a kind of values-based reinforcement of ideas, but instead we shift the dialogue to more mechanistic understanding, which is highly complex. And that's why people, this intensity drops down, and that reduces extremity and polarization, So those are two, I think, the two things that my mind goes to very immediately, right? This is about a meta-awareness of how we relate to our ideas. And it's about an awareness, again, of our limits, kind of learning to disclaim our limitations.
Yeah, thank you. I see great potential just taking those 2 points and really working with them and ways to loop it back in. I was thinking too, the titanium man of,
absolutely. Right.
you
Yeah.
know, bringing that in to support people, because I think a lot of times they need to be met in the feeling that they have something that has some rightness to it. And if that's not
Right.
acknowledged, whereas just the opposing point of view, you've lost rapport and it doesn't go anywhere. But to say, wow, interesting idea. And I think that's one of the things I see Ryan doing from the previous presentation that I really liked, and want to be modeling that. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you.
Karen?
Yes, goodness, this goes on developing beautifully. Yes, with Ryan's titanium man technique, this is what I've learned through nonviolent communication, which is none of us will really be able to listen to a person with whom we're in conflict unless and until we really feel that we've been heard, because we have been heard. And that's what Ryan's titanium man does.
Right.
And then there was another piece of it. Let's see, which is what you just described, TJ. I forget what you called it, but you invite the person with whom you are communicating to walk them through a more mechanistic explanation, and that lowers the intensity. But what that achieves, what that clicked in my mind, is Robert Keegan, who's one of the great developmental psychologists, and Ken Wilber, refers to him constantly. Ken Wilber likes the quote, "We go up to the next level of cognitive complexity," the next one of Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Robert Keegan's term for that is the subject of one stage becomes the object of the subject of the next stage. That is part of that mechanism that leverages an individual up into that next more complex level of cognitive development. And that's the connection that I made, rightly or wrongly, with what you're saying, the process of inviting the person to explicate what they're saying in somewhat more mechanistic terms. We're not doing a call it here, I'm going to help you grow up to be a higher stage, more like me. I mean, that's
Right.
a mindset we just need to acknowledge in ourselves and discard. But that's what I just heard. That's the connection I made with what you just said about the mechanistic explanation. This sounds so powerful. I mean, I'm really excited that this is happening. Thank you for the work you're doing.
Yeah, there's a sense of, to elaborate on that, there's a sense of good faith
Yes.
engagement and a benefit of the doubt towards the complexity of the other side.
Yes.
Happening
And the good
Right.
faith is absolutely essential here.
Right.
So that needs to be where it starts from.
Yeah, that's the only way we can, like, intersubjectively facilitate complexity at all. So I think.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions?
Okay.
TJ, this has really
Yeah,
been fantastic. Thank you.
Oh.
Oh, go ahead, Eric. Go
Just
ahead.
to quickly pipe in, because Ryan had put slides in up above, and some of us were not able to open that as a corrupted file. I think one person did, but most weren't. And so I'm wondering, TJ, would we contact you, or how might we go about getting those slides?
Absolutely. I'm going to type in. I'm not as literate with Zoom meetings here. I'm going to type into the chat my email address again. And anyone is welcome to hit me up. I'll share the slides. I can share, further sort of bibliographic, like more links to ideas and books that have informed this project. There's a lot of great stuff out there, obviously. So yeah, please feel free to email me. And Ryan as well, I'm sure would appreciate that. So, and thank you all. Yeah, I greatly appreciate. Again, I have a lot of respect for the Integral project, and I'm really happy to be interfacing with you guys and building a relationship here. I think it's really exciting.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Yeah. Okay.
We are complete.
Yeah, I think that sounds
Okay.
good. Yeah. Mhm.
Thank you. A pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I really appreciate all your attention.